All right, class, today we get into chapter 14, which only leaves us chapter 14 and chapter 15 remaining for this term. So chapter 14 really starts off with getting into the spinal cord. And we start to look at not only the spinal cord, but also the spinal nerves. We also take a look at how the nervous system utilizes the spinal cord as a link for communication. And so we'll talk about the neurons and how they interact with each other and where they interact and how many neurons are in certain pathways. But when we look at the spinal cord, we look at some of the major functions of not only the spinal cord, but also the spinal nerves. So when we look at the spinal cord and the spinal nerves, one of the functions is to act as a structural and functional link between the brain and the rest of the body. And what this does is, because of the motor and sensory pathways, it allows a two-way communication to and from the brain by allowing information to come in as a sensory pathway and allowing information to go out in the motor pathway. We also utilize spinal reflexes. Now, spinal reflexes are responses to muscle or other tissue that do not involve the brain. And that's basically because they utilize a pathway that sends the sensory signal up to the spinal cord and directly loops right back out along the motor pathway. And this provides us with a very fast reaction to a particular stimulus. So as we look at the spinal cord, just as we did with the brain tissue and the anterior portion of the nervous system, we also have to look at the development of the spinal cord. And the spinal cord is going to develop from the caudal neural tube that we saw as we developed the brain. The neural canal of the tube will actually become the central canal of the cord. We're going to see two different types of tissue here. We're going to see the basal plates, and they're going to develop into the anterior and the lateral horns and the anterior great commissure. And the axons are going to grow to the effectors. Now, I know you may not know what the anterior and lateral horns are yet, but we'll talk about those here coming up. What I want you to think about is, I want you to think about that gray matter core. And I want you to remember that butterfly. The anterior horn is the anterior part of the wing of that butterfly. The lateral horn is a small little section in between the anterior and the posterior horns. And then the anterior great commissure is going to be that little section right around the central canal, and that's going to connect the right side and the left side. And again, the axons here are growing towards the effectors. Now, the alar plates develop into the posterior horn and the posterior great commissure. The axons here are going to form the white matter of the cord. So if we take a look at spinal cord development, again, this is what roughly the final product has some semblance of. Although if you notice, we're still in week 9 of development. But at least you can kind of understand where the cross-section or how that cross-section represents a fully developed spinal cord. So if we look at the development here in week 4, you'll see we have the neural crest cells. You'll see here we have the neural canal, and then here we have that neural tube. So we take a look at what happens by week 6 then. Here you'll notice that we have our alar plate, and here is our basal plate. Our alar plate essentially is turning into the sensory neurons, or the sensory side of the spinal cord. The basal plate really turns into more of the motor side of the spinal cord. And you'll notice then down here, we're starting to develop into some semblance of that butterfly gray matter core. So if we start to then look at the cross-section anatomy of the spinal cord, it's going to extend inferior from the brain's medulla through the vertebral canal. And remember, it basically starts as the spinal cord once it hits the foramen magnum. And then it goes all the way down towards your lower back and into your buttock region. There are 4 parts. There's the cervical, the thoracic, the lumbar, and the sacral. Specifically, the spinal cord begins at the foramen magnum, but the cord itself, we'll notice, actually ends at the L1 vertebrae, with the conus medullaris. Now that doesn't mean that we don't have some extensions of the spinal cord coming off lower than that, but it does not go all the way down the vertebral column. It ends at that L1 vertebrae. Now, the conus medullaris is kind of this tapered structure on the spinal cord. And so I'll do my best to somewhat draw it here. So if you look at the end of the spinal cord, you'll notice that it somewhat tapers off kind of into a point. This structure here is going to be that conus medullaris. Now, once we get past the conus medullaris, we're going to notice that our spinal nerve roots actually extend inferiorly. And that's going to be the cauda equina. And if you break this down, cauda equina means towards the bottom or the end. Equine references horses. So what this means is this indicates a horse's tail. So if you think about what a horse's tail looks like with all the fine hairs, or coarse hairs, I guess, coming off of it, how it sways, that's what this ending of our spinal cord looks like. So here's our conus medullaris, but we're actually going to see that we'll have additional nerve roots extending down inferiorly down the rest of that vertebral canal. And this is what we actually see at the very bottom of our vertebral canal. Throughout the spinal cord, we're going to have two widened regions with a greater number of neurons. And this is going to be where we have a lot of our plexus and nerves coming off of the spinal cord that go into our extremities. So we're going to have the cervical enlargement, and these are going to be the neurons that innervate the upper limbs. And then we're going to have the lumbar enlargement, and these neurons innervate our lower limbs. So if we take a look at this anatomy of our spinal cord, you'll notice here where we have the color-coded sections. Here's our cervical region, thoracic region, lumbar region, and then all the way down into the sacral component. Now you'll notice that the lumbar and the sacral regions are a little bit different here. The lumbar region is relatively small. Again, the spinal cord ends at about the L1 level. But then you'll notice this extension of all these fine little nerves, these fibers. And these are the nerve roots that make up that sacral component. Here you'll see the conus medullaris as it starts to taper off. And down here you'll see the cauda equina, where this is basically all nerve roots. And you see the same thing on this graphic. It tapers off kind of into a point, right where my pointer is. And then you'll see all these nerve roots and nerves coming off that help make up that horse's tail. As we continue to look at the anatomy of the spinal cord, one of the things we have to look at is the anatomy of a spinal nerve. Now remember, we identified this before. A nerve is a collection of axons in the PNS, okay? And so that is one of those definitions that, again, we have talked about it numerous times. A spinal nerve is also going to have these connective tissue wrappings that we discussed earlier. The epineurium, the perineurium, and the endoneurium. The epineurium is around the nerve, the perineurium is around the fascicle, and the endoneurium is specifically around the axon. And when we look at the spinal nerves, there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves, so 31 on both the right and the left side. So as we look at the anatomy of the spinal nerve, we're going to notice that we have these rootlets that are coming off of the spinal cord. And all of these little rootlets end up merging at different levels to form our spinal nerve root. Now, the posterior root contains our sensory neurons. And within this posterior root, then, we develop into the posterior root ganglion. You'll also see this identified as a dorsal root ganglion. And it's going to contain the cell bodies of these neurons. So again, understand the terminology. A ganglion is a collection of cell bodies in the PNS. And so as we understand that a posterior or a dorsal root ganglion develops, it's going to contain the cell bodies of these neurons. The other thing we want to understand about the sensory neurons is that these are unipolar cells, which means they have just the one process coming off of them. So if we kind of draw this out, you'll notice that we have our cell body, we have the one process that goes one direction, one process that goes the other direction. Now, when you do this with numerous cells and you have multiple cell bodies at this location, I apologize for my terrible computer drawing here, but when this starts to occur with numerous cells, that circular component here becomes our ganglion as we are collecting more and more cell bodies at that location. Now, the anterior root is going to contain the motor neurons, and it's going to come off of our anterior horn. Now, each spinal nerve forms then where the roots of the posterior root and the anterior root actually come together and form. So this takes fibers of both the motor side and the sensory side, and they form together, and this gives us what we know as a mixed nerve that has both motor and sensory parts to it. So this is going to be a really good graphic for you to take a look at and understand, and really help you understand the anatomy of the spinal cord at these lower levels. So again, you'll notice all these small little sections coming off of the spinal cord. These are the rootlets. So we have the anterior rootlets here. We have the posterior rootlets here. You'll notice that as those rootlets come together, they develop the posterior root and the anterior root. We can come over to this side and see all of these structures identified. And then back here, we have this dorsal root ganglion, or the posterior root ganglion. And you'll see it right here with these unipolar cells. Again, the dorsal or the posterior side is the sensory side. Here is our dorsal horn or the posterior horn. You'll notice that oftentimes I will use those terms interchangeably between posterior and dorsal and anterior and ventral, okay? So if I use one or the other, don't get confused. Posterior and dorsal, synonymous. Anterior and ventral, synonymous. So as we look at this posterior root, then again, these are the sensory components. So here we have our sensation coming in. Here is our posterior or dorsal root ganglion. And here we have that part of the fiber still coming in. And it's going to ending up connecting in this dorsal horn. Here we have our anterior rootlets and our anterior horn. And here we have our motor pathway going out this direction. Here is our anterior root with our anterior rootlets. And then here we have the connection between those two roots. And this gives us the true definition of the spinal nerve, okay, where we have both motor and sensory fibers joining together. So how do we protect and support the spinal cord? Well, one, we know that the spinal cord is protected by bone, and that's what the vertebral column is for. Just as we had in the brain, we also have meninges, and those are basically continuous into the spinal cord. And then we also have cerebrospinal fluid. So you'll notice that for the most part, it's really all the same structures with the exception of really the blood-brain barrier. Now the vertebral column houses the spinal cord, and the cord passes through the vertebral canal, or the large opening that the column makes. And then each spinal nerve root is going to exit through an intervertebral foramen. And if you remember or understand our terminology, we can break down intervertebral foramen. Foramen indicates hole. Intervertebral means between the vertebrae. And so we're really looking at a hole between the vertebrae. And that's where our spinal nerves are able to exit from. So if we look at some of the meninges, we have the same three meninges in the spinal cord that we did in the brain. We have the dura mater, which is the tough outermost layer, and it's that layer of dense irregular connective tissue, and it helps to stabilize the spinal cord. The arachnoid mater is a web-like layer. It's external to the pia. We also have the subarachnoid space, which is the area deep to the arachnoid through which the CSF flows, all of which is the same as the brain. And then we have the pia mater. And the pia mater is this delicate layer that adheres to the spinal cord. Again, same as the brain tissue. It's made of elastic and collagen fibers. However, one of the things that we have off of the pia mater are called denticulate ligaments. Now, denticulate ligaments are these lateral extensions of the pia mater, and they help to suspend the spinal cord. And so they basically go out and they extend out and attach themselves basically to the dura mater. We also have the filum terminale, which is the anchoring point of the pia mater, and it travels all the way to the end, the inferior end of the spinal cord to the coccyx. And that helps to anchor the inferior part of the spinal cord. So again, here we take a cross section of the vertebrae and the spinal cord. And you'll notice where all these structures end up falling so far of what we talked about. So you'll have our spinal cord, the cross section. Here's our gray matter core. Here, this section is our anterior horn. Here's our posterior horn. Again, this is ventral, or this is motor, and this is dorsal and sensory. We have our layers of the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. Again, the pia mater covers the surface of the spinal cord. The arachnoid mater is that middle layer with the subarachnoid space. And then we also have the dura mater. Now, the dura mater is this tough layer. And again, you'll notice that we have these extensions of the pia. Now, these denticulate ligaments, as they extend out, they attach themselves to the dura mater, and essentially they are acting as anchor points. And so if you think about having a whole bunch of these little ligaments that extend from the pia, they essentially are holding that spinal cord into place as you move to prohibit too much excess movement of the cord within the canal. As we look at the spinal nerve, you'll notice here's our intervertebral foramen of the bone. If we stack the vertebrae on top of each other, this allows that spinal nerve to actually exit the area around the vertebral column. Here's our anterior view of the spinal cord. Again, you get a chance to see all of these structures from the gray matter core, the central canal. Here's our commissure that connects the right and left side. Here's our dorsal horn, our ventral horn. Normally we would see a lateral horn here that sticks out a little bit, but it's only going to be found in certain areas of the spinal cord. And we'll touch on that here in a little bit as well. Here's our posterior rootlets that again are sensory, that form our posterior root, our anterior rootlets that form our anterior root, our dorsal root ganglion that again is a sensory component, and then we have those two roots joined together that form the spinal nerve. I will tell you this graphic here is going to be a good graphic to make sure that you have a good idea of how things work, because you'll likely find this on your fourth exam, and you'll also likely find this on your final exam. So as we look at the gray matter core and we look at what gray matter is, again, we know gray matter at this point is unmyelinated. The gray matter, however, is made of the neuron cell bodies and the dendrites, as well as a handful of the unmyelinated axons. The other thing we're going to find are some of the glial cells that are involved with the CNS. Within the gray matter, we're going to see this mass of tissue, this gray matter core, and it's going to project from the center of the spinal cord. So we're going to find that we have the posterior horn, the anterior horn, and the lateral horn. Again, if we identify some of the other terminology, you may also see this identified as the dorsal horn. You may find that the anterior horn is identified as the ventral horn. And then the lateral horn will still be the lateral horn. Now, if we look at the posterior or the dorsal horn, it's going to house the axons of the sensory neurons and cell bodies of other additional interneurons. The anterior horn is going to house the cell bodies of our somatic motor neurons. Okay? Now make that distinction, because these are the somatic motor neurons, which means the anterior horn helps to control skeletal muscle. The lateral horn, that, however, houses the cell bodies of our autonomic motor neurons. So the neurons that we have control over are going to be found in the anterior horn. The neurons of the muscle tissue that we don't have control over is going to be found in the lateral horn. Now make a note that the lateral horn cells are only going to be present in T1 to L2. So really it's only going to be found mostly in the thoracic spine, or the thoracic part of the spinal cord. So that leads us then to our gray commissure. Now our gray commissure is this horizontal band of gray matter, and it surrounds that central canal. Remember what a commissure is. A commissure is a group of cells or group of neurons that help to connect tissue on opposite sides. In this case, the gray matter contains unmyelinated axons that help to connect the left and the right gray matter sections. This will also be a very good one for you to understand because it really shows a great breakdown of what you find in this gray matter core. It also gives you a really good understanding of where a lot of these connections and these synapses are, of which we will talk about here in the next few slides. But you'll notice that we have, again, our ventral horn, which is involved with the somatic motor neurons. Our lateral horn here is going to involve the autonomic neurons. This lateral horn in this particular graphic isn't quite as identified as what it will be on other graphics. But then here we also have our group of interneurons and the dorsal horn that's involved with the sensory pathway. Now the sensory pathway is going to involve both the somatic sensory pathway and the visceral sensory pathway. And so this table, this chart up here, really helps to identify what sections of the gray matter core we are referencing. These tables also help to identify what types of cells are coming in and where they go. So again, please spend a little time. If you need to, hit pause or come back and hit pause and review it if you need to. But really looking at this graphic really gives you a great understanding of what the cross section of the spinal cord truly looks like. And we also have to look at the distribution of white matter. And I think we all understand at this point that white matter are myelinated fibers. So that's what these are, myelinated axons that go to and from the brain. Most of our white matter are going to be tracts, and they're going to be ascending or descending tracts, which means sensory or motor. We also include some transverse tracts, which are commissural fibers. And these are going to cross from one side to the other. And again, you'll see that term here, tracts again, collections of nerve processes found in the CNS. So we take a look at this graphic. This is a cross section of the spinal cord that shows more of the tracts of the spinal cord. Now, I'm not going to have you know these, but I do want you to take a look at a few things. You'll notice the terminology of these tracts. And so while I'm not going to have you memorize the names, I do want you to be able to identify when you see a tract, whether it's ascending or descending, and where it goes to and from. And you should be able to do this based on the name. Now, granted, if you look at fasciculus gracilis or fasciculus cuneatus, those you may not be able to identify other than with memorization. However, if we look down here and we look at the posterior spinocerebellar tract, or if we look at the rubrospinal tract or the cortical spinal tract, any of these tracts you should be able to identify based on their terminology. Now, you may not know exactly what these are, but if you look at the lateral cortical spinal tract, this should tell you that it goes from the cortex to the spine. If it's going from the cortex, which is up high, and the spine, which is down low, that tells you that it's a descending tract, which means this would be a motor tract. If we look at this one, we have a spinocerebellar tract. It starts in the spine and goes to the cerebellum, which means you know the two places that it goes, which one's higher versus which one's lower, and how do they have to travel. So this you should be able to identify as an ascending tract or a sensory tract. Okay? So those are the components that I want you to be able to identify when it comes to the tracts. Not necessarily their names, but just understanding what the terminology of the names actually means. Again, here we see the cross sections of the spinal cord at different levels. Here we see at the cervical level, the thoracic level, the lumbar level, and the sacral level. Again, very similar in structure, but let's take a look at the difference between the cervical and the thoracic. You'll notice here we have that gray matter core again, that butterfly, but notice the thoracic area. Notice there are some areas that are a little bit smaller and a little bit larger. Notice that the lateral horn is more prevalent in the thoracic than what it is in the cervical. Because in the cervical, we don't deal with the lateral horn like we do in the thoracic region. You'll also notice that some of the sensory and motor areas are a little bit different in the thoracic spine compared to what they would be in the cervical or lumbar. And that mainly is because a lot of those structures in the cervical and lumbar really are going to our extremities. Now we'll take a look at the different conduction pathways that we have within our spinal cord. When we look at the spinal cord and we look at these pathways, we can identify them as either sensory or motor. Now, sensory pathways ascend toward the brain, which means they're going from the body up to the brain, so they're going upwards. Motor pathways, on the other hand, do the reverse. They're sending signals from the brain out to the rest of the body, so they are descending pathways, so they descend from the brain. So there's some common pathway characteristics that we'll talk about. One, the pathways are paired, meaning that there's going to be a right and a left side. Again, these are organized in tracts. The cell locations are going to include axons that are located within the spinal cord tracts. The cell bodies are going to be located either in the ganglia, in the spinal cord gray horns, meaning the anterior, posterior, or lateral, and then also in the brain gray matter. Each pathway is made up of a chain of either 2 or typically 3 neurons, depending on whether we're referencing a sensory pathway or a motor pathway. And then also most pathways decussate, which again means crossing over, meaning that one side of the brain controls the opposite side of the body. So the axons will actually cross the midline so that the brain possesses the information for that contralateral side. There are some uncrossed pathways that actually do work on the ipsilateral side of the body, however. So let's take a look at some of the sensory pathways. We know that sensory input is transmitted through the spinal cord, but what it does is it originates from our general sensoreceptors, of which there are 2 categories. We can either have somatic sensory, or what we would know as somatosensory, and these receptors are either tactile receptors or proprioceptors. Tactile receptors detect characteristics of an object. So oftentimes we're talking about touch, things like pressure, temperature. Proprioceptors, on the other hand, are what we find in and around the joints. So proprioceptors help detect stretch in the joints, the muscles, and the tendons. Our second type of category is a visceral sensory receptor. And these are going to detect changes in the viscera, or what we would typically think of as an organ. So again, somatic, again, think of the characteristics of what somatic means. Skin, skeletal muscle, joint. Tactile receptors deal more with the skin. Proprioceptors deal more with the skeletal muscle and the joint. Visceral sensory receptors then, again, are more internal organs. They deal with the viscera. So let's take a look at the categories of the sensory pathways. So when we look at the pathway, the sensory pathway typically uses a series of 3 neurons. So this chain from external body or proprioceptors involves a 3 neuron chain. Our primary or the first order neuron is what we typically think of when we think of the neurons in the extremity. It has a peripheral ending, which means these are mostly the receptors. The cell body of this particular neuron is going to be located in the posterior root ganglion. And then the axon then leads to that secondary neuron. Now, in this category or in this pathway, including the motor pathway, there's going to be a few things that we want to know. One, we want to know where the cell body of that particular neuron is. And two, we want to know where it synapses. So these are going to be the key factors that we want to understand when it comes to understanding these relay pathways. So our primary or first order neuron, the cell body is going to be located in the posterior root ganglion. Now, it's going to synapse in the dorsal horn. So I'll type these up here in just a second so that we kind of have them on the screen and you can hit pause and write them down. The secondary neuron or second order neuron is an interneuron. So it's going to receive the primary input and then it extends up to synapse with the tertiary neuron or up into the cerebellum. In this case, the cell body is going to be located in the dorsal horn or the posterior horn, and it's going to synapse either in the cerebellum or typically in the thalamus. Now, our third order neuron or a tertiary neuron is also an interneuron. It's going to receive the secondary neuron input and extends upwards towards the somatosensory cortex of the parietal lobe of the cerebrum. If we remember, that primary somatosensory cortex is the area in the post-central gyrus that receives sensory information. And again, if we go back to what we just talked about with the secondary order neuron or second order neuron, the cell body is going to be located either in the thalamus or in the cerebellum. So the third order neuron, the cell body is located where we just said, and then it synapses in the primary somatosensory cortex. So if we draw a couple circles here on things that are important, where is the cell body? In the posterior horn. Where is the cell body? The thalamus or the cerebrum. And so if you just follow the pathway, you'll notice that the next synapse typically falls where the next cell body is, with the exception of that primary neuron. So the primary neuron is going to synapse with the secondary neuron, and that's going to occur in the posterior horn. The cell body of the secondary neuron is in the posterior horn. The cell body of the tertiary neuron is going to be in the thalamus and the cerebellum. The synapse between the secondary and the tertiary neurons are going to be in the thalamus or the cerebellum. So again, you just want to kind of follow along from one connection to the next. So here we kind of see the pathway that we really just discussed. So I went ahead and typed all the information out that we would actually want to know in this regard. But you'll notice down here, we start at the bottom. Remember, this is the sensory pathway. And so this is an ascending pathway. So we have the information coming out from our proprioceptive input, which would be joints, skeletal muscle, tendons. So we have that cell body located in the dorsal root ganglion. It does not synapse here. It will synapse in the dorsal horn, which will be right there. Here's the cell body of our second order neuron, and it's going to be in the dorsal horn. It's going to traverse the spinal cord in an ascending pathway, and it's going to come up and synapse, in this case, in the cerebellum. The other place it could synapse again is in the thalamus. From here, then, we're going to have the cell body of the third order neuron, which in this case, it's not shown. And that synapse also takes place here in the cerebellum, or again, in the thalamus, that's also not shown here. From this point, then, we ascend all the way up to the primary somatosensory cortex. And again, I do have all of that stuff, all the information listed here as to where the cell bodies are located and where the synapses are between each of these neurons. So again, if you need to hit pause, write this stuff down, that's perfectly fine. So our next pathway then is the motor pathway. And it's going to control the effectors such as our skeletal muscle. This is a 2-neuron chain pathway. So it's going to start in the brain, and it again includes at least 2 neurons. We're really talking about specifically when we get down to the basics of a 2-neuron chain. We have an upper motor neuron and a lower motor neuron. The upper motor neuron is in the upper levels. It's going to be in the motor cortex, and it contacts the lower motor neuron. The lower motor neuron then is in the spinal cord, and it's going to be located within the anterior horn of the gray matter core. This is the neuron that's going to traverse out into the extremity and excite the muscle. So this is our cortical spinal tract. Again, cortico referring to the cortex, spinal referring to the spine. So it goes from the cortex down to the spine, so it indicates a descending tract. So I've gone ahead and typed out the same information that we talked about with the ascending pathways over here on the left. Again, same thing. If you want to jot that down, go ahead, hit pause, do whatever you need to do. But if we look at the pathway, we have the primary motor cortex up here, and this is the location of the cell body of that upper motor neuron. It's going to traverse its way all the way down through the brain, down through the brainstem, into the spinal cord. And once it gets to the level that it's exiting, it's going to synapse at the anterior horn or the ventral horn. And this is where we find our lower motor neuron and the lower motor neuron cell body. Now, what you should notice about this cortical spinal tract and this descending tract is it crosses over. You will also notice that there are 2 pathways or 2 neurons here. One you'll notice crosses over early, and this crosses over around the level of the medulla oblongata. The other one will come down and cross over at the level that it's going to exit. And so either way is fine in this situation, but just understand that there is a crossing over there. Again, here we have the cell body of the lower motor neuron, and it's going to leave through the ventral root or the anterior root, exit through the spinal nerve, and go out into the effector. And so again, in this case, the effector is going to be the skeletal muscle, and this is the pathway for a descending tract, or the descending pathway, if you will. Now, as far as the distribution of the spinal nerves, there's also some anatomy that we have to discuss when it comes to the fibers leaving the intervertebral foramen or leaving the spinal cord. And then the spinal cord will split off. Now, after the spinal nerve splits, we have the posterior ramus, which is going to be a relatively small branch. And it's going to go towards the back tissue, particularly the skeletal muscle tissue of the back. The anterior ramus is a larger branch. It's going to eventually split off into multiple other branches. But at different levels, this ramus is going to innervate the anterior and lateral trunk and the upper and the lower limbs. So it's going to depend on where it actually is located within the spinal cord, and that determines where this anterior ramus goes. The characteristic of the anterior ramus is that we're going to find it typically in a lot of our plexi. So our brachial plexus, cervical plexus, lumbar plexus, and sacral plexus are all going to be involved with this anterior ramus. And then we also have what we call rami communicantins. And these are small branches of autonomic fibers. And they're going to extend between the spinal nerve and the sympathetic trunk ganglion, which we will also talk about in a little bit. And these are going to be ganglia that are interconnected in the sympathetic trunk that happen to fall parallel to the vertebral column. So if we take a look at these structures, again, this is going to be the body of the vertebrae, and you have the rest of the vertebrae to the back with the spinous process and the transverse process. Here's your spinal cord in the middle. You'll notice here we have our ventral root. Here is our dorsal root. This is our spinal nerve as it exits the intervertebral foramen. You'll notice that after it exits, it's going to branch off and split. Here's a small branch. This is the posterior ramus, and it's going to go towards the back musculature. Then we have our larger anterior ramus, and this is going to be what innervates the anterior side of the body or the extremities. The other characteristic here is we have rami communicantes, and you're going to notice that there are two of them, and they connect to a sympathetic trunk ganglion. And those ganglion actually run the distance up and down the vertebral column just outside of where that spinal nerve exited. So here's going to be one portion of it, and here's another portion of it. So our spinal nerve is one of the things we've talked a little bit about, some of the motor portion of it. But when we talk about the sensory part of it, we also have to look at how those spinal nerves affect the dermatomes. Now, dermatomes are going to be segments of skin that are supplied by a single spinal nerve. Now, what this does is it helps to localize damage to one or more spinal nerves, basically helping us to identify what part of the spine or what spinal nerve has been injured in the case of starting to lose sensation. So if we look at the loss of sensation on the medial arm and the forearm, that can help us to identify C8 damage or C8 spinal nerve damage. All of our spinal nerves except for C1 participate in a dermatome. So notice all of them except C1 participate in dermatomes. And the dermatomes are also then involved in referred visceral pain. And we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. One thing that we want to know is that typically, even though we identify that the dermatomes typically are supplied or indicates one spinal nerve, it's very rare that one dermatome is supplied strictly by that one spinal nerve. Oftentimes there's a little bit of overlap, and that does allow to help maintain some sensation across the dermatomes, although it does allow us to be a little bit more specific in the identification of them. And so let's go ahead and make dermatome our code word for the day. So our attendance code word for this section is going to be dermatome. So we take a look at a dermatome map, and it really is pretty straightforward. It really shows the levels of where all of our dermatomes really innervate. And you'll notice that they really just kind of go straight down the body. You got C2, 3, 4, 5 that go to the upper part of the chest. And then you get the 6, 7, 8, and T1 that really start to come up the arm. So once you hit C5, C5 starts to go down the arm a little bit. C6 is further down the arm. C7's in the hand. C8's the inside part or the pinky finger area, and also goes up the inside part of the forearm. And then you get to T1 and T2 that innervate the upper arm and the armpit before you get back into T3, 4, 5 all the way down. You'll notice when you get to the lower levels, particularly the lumbar levels, these are the ones that really start to go down the legs a little bit. So they start to wrap L1, L2, 3, 4, and 5. And then you flip yourself over and you get a chance to see the backside. And this also includes a lot of our sacral nerves. So the front side of the leg typically involves the lumbar spinal nerves. The back side of the leg typically involves the sacral spinal nerves. And this will be where we stop for today, and we'll pick up with the rest of chapter 14 here in our next lecture.